Out of every snippet of lore inside of Silksong, the Weavers are by far my favourite. The main character of Silksong, Hornet, is a Weaver, and considering this, a lot of the lore is focused around said Weavers. At face value, the Weavers are just very cool, but the true story of the Weavers goes a lot deeper and a lot darker than simply just being very cool. And that is the topic for today's video. I'm not going to ask you to subscribe right now, as I think that's really silly, you haven't even watched the video. If, at the end of the video, you have enjoyed, please consider leaving a like and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. And of course, if you don't enjoy, feel free to drop a dislike. Inside of the first Hollow Knight, our knowledge of the Weavers was very limited. We only had a few sources of information. Those few are Hornet, Hera the Beast, who is a dreamer that just so happened to be a Weaver as well and the mother to Hornet, the Weaver Nest inside of the Deep Nest, and of course probably the most important and the most informative, the Weaverlings. Even considering a lot of that information, a lot of mystery still surrounded the Weavers. That is until Silksong. Inside of Silksong we get an absolute shitload of information. Upon defeating the first Sinner boss fight, which is in fact another Weaver, we come across a cutscene which shows the origins of the Weavers. Once upon a time, scurrying around in the dark of Farloom was the spiders, and they would have stayed just that, spiders, without the interference from someone called Grandmother Silk. We see this kind of divine imagery of this grand light shining upon the spider before a line of silk strikes it, and it begins to morph, evolve into something humanoid, into something intelligent. These beings which were uplifted to a higher plane by Grandmother Silk would eventually become the Weavers, and would inherit the power of silk bestowed upon them by their mother. I've seen some people saying that the Weavers aren't actually the children of the grandmother, and now obviously originally they were spiders, but the process of which they were uplifted is completely different, or at least it seems it, to what we see in the first Hollow Knight. When these bugs were uplifted, they didn't really gain any sort of mystical power or inherit something unique from the being that uplifted them. The Weavers, on the other hand, gained silk, an ability that is only used by the grandmother and her children. Now, why do I say only her children when there's literally enemies in the Citadel that use silk? Well, it has something to do with a bit of dialogue that Hornet says. She talks about how her silk is her own. Now, it very much implies, considering this, and considering she knows a lot about the Weavers and their silk, that these bugs are in fact just borrowing the power from Grandmother Silk. Just thought I'd clarify that, as I said previously, I've seen some people saying that they aren't actually the children of the grandmother. We've started off pretty light, we've talked about the origins, but it's nothing too crazy. This is the part now where you need to buckle your britches so tight your guts popping out. The origin place of the Weavers is inside of Farloom. And yet inside the first Hollow Knight, the Weaverling charm talks about how the Weavers returned to their homeland. As this is found in Hollow Nest, we can only assume they returned back to Farloom. But there is also multiple mentions inside of Silksong of the Weavers leaving Farloom. In regards to the species, there were two trips. One fleeing from Farloom, and one returning. The haunted silk controls the minds of those inside of Farloom. So many are consumed by the silk, and are subsequently turned into eternal slaves for Mother Silk's will. The Weavers eventually seem to understand their role in all of this. They were ascended to a higher plane, and in doing so became part silk. The grandmother controls people through silk. The fact they're made out of it would make them prime targets to be manipulated and mind controlled by the grandmother. At some point they must have came to this conclusion, for they planned to flee. Inside of their secret hideouts, there's a map which depicts ways out of Farloom. The rune harp talks about the sisters, aka the Weavers, being free, to escape her silken gaze, and free of the web and service eternal. But before they fled, before they truly gave up, there was one last attempt. Of course it didn't work, but Eva was born. They call her the despised child. They say she was an attempt, a wish, to create divinity, only it was created in a body far too frail. And just like that, they cast away their shame. This divine being trapped in a cage of iron. It has been years since Eva was left, eons even, and she is miserable. She sits there and all she wishes is to level up our crest, to pass on abilities to us. Her misery knows no escape until the end of her quest. To escape from the horrible life she is being cast, she decides the best option is to bind herself and join us inside of Hornet's shell. Make no mistake, once Eva does this, she is dead. She's there inside of Hornet's shell, but the Eva that was talking to us, that we were talking to, is dead. That version of her will never come about again. I was originally going to say that she loses her free will when she becomes a part of us, but in a sense, this is her, for once, taking action of her own life. It's sad, no doubt, but she's finally getting some kind of control in a life that was decided to her by weavers of times past. Eva says that she is not a prisoner out of malice, and yet the rune harp doesn't seem to talk very kindly about her. It does come off as quite malicious. My view on Eva is that she is a traumatized being that was stuffed away inside a cage for eons and is coping with herself, telling herself that it's not malicious, that it's done for some greater good, when in fact it seems very likely the weavers stuffed her in there out of shame. Earlier I mentioned this wasn't the only crime that the weavers committed. Another example of this is the Void. In the Abyss, you'll find one of the secret hideouts of the weavers, and inside it you'll see a tablet which talks about Void given form. This sounds very similar to what we see with the vessels inside of Hollow Knight. There are two more cherry on the top moments. Inside the Abyss as well, we find an arcane egg. This arcane egg very clearly talks about vessels. No will, no self, shade. No will and no self is very similar to the kind of talk the Pale King instilled inside the vessels. The last part, shade, is something also heavily linked to the vessels. When you get defeated inside of Hollow Knight, your mask cracks and you become a shade. The shade is you and you are a void entity. The idea of vessels seemed to have been created by the Pale King inside of Hollow Knight, but now inside of Silksong, it seems very likely that the idea of vessels has been around for a much longer time. Remember how I was talking about a second cherry on the top? Well, if you compare the architecture inside of the Abyss, inside of Hollow Knight, and the Abyss of the Weave Nest in the Abyss inside of Silksong, they're eerily similar. Yes, there's some Hollow Nest symbols, but the whole sort of Weaver architecture is seen. And it makes perfect sense. If the Weavers had a past with dealing with the Void, manipulating it, making it into vessels, experimenting with it, of course they'd help the Pale King. Of course they would. I mean, Hera the Beast and the Pale King birthed Hornet. There was definite alliances going on between the Weavers and Hollow Nest. If this is true, it means the Weavers are also responsible for the atrocities committed against the Pale King's children, and that the Pale King wasn't the only one who decided that no cost was too great. There's an idea that I haven't been able to get out of my head. The den of the Weavers that we find in the Abyss holds the ability to ascend. This ascension ability allows us to escape the Abyss. This is one of the secret silk arts of the Weavers. If you look again at the cutscene where the Weavers are born, it actually looks quite similar to what happens when Hornet uses this same ascend ability. It strikes down, and instead of striking to a surface, it strikes into these spiders. The Abyss is home to many creatures. We see this in both the original Hollow Knight and in Silksong. Would it be so far-fetched to think that these spiders originated from the same area? In the cutscene where it shows them being ascended, they're in basically pitch black. Although that isn't enough to say that they're from the Abyss, considering the Abyss inside of Silksong is filled with the design and architecture of the Weavers, not to mention the fact that they were studying the Void, and also they had an ability, a silk ability, unique to them that they could use to escape the Abyss. I think it's very likely this is where they are from. This is only further proven by the architecture in the Abyss inside the original Hollow Knight. Eva was buried deep to hide her from the silken gaze. How did so many Weavers escape Farloom? Inside of Hornet's flashback, we see so many. How on earth did they escape? Well, if being deep down is a way to escape her gaze, then what better option than the abyss? Which would explain why the architecture is already there in the original Hollow Knight, because they escaped Farloom through going through pathways of the abyss. And ding ding ding, there is also pathways from the abyss directly to Deep Nest, which is exactly where the Weavers ended up settling down. To me, it seems very likely this is where they escaped from. Now, of course, if you look at the map which details different routes out, there's multiple. I think it's also very likely different Weavers went upon different paths to act as a distraction, so if for some reason they got caught, it wouldn't be all of them that got caught, some would get away. And make no mistake, the grandmother did hunt down the Weavers. Inside the opening cutscene of Silksong, we are captured. We are kidnapped and taken to Farloom. But the truth of the matter is a lot darker. Just before the final boss fight, if you break a secret wall, you end up in a secret room with dozens of cages that look exactly the same as the one Hornet was taken in. This would be enough to raise eyebrows as is, but when you read the sign that is upon them, you realise that the grandmother was hunting the Weavers all along. On the cages is basically mini mission reports. It talks about how many people were lost capturing the Weaver. It talks about how much Weaver blood they have. Not to mention also the status of the Weaver. The most interesting one is this one. It talks about how a Weaver was captured, they were staked to service, and that they were tracked and taken down beneath the City of Steel. An area that we have no idea about and have never heard about. The Weaver this is talking about is none other than the Widow, the one that we find inside of Bellheart. Why do I believe this? Well, there's multiple reasons, and I believe it's very concrete. The cage says that this Weaver was staked to service. If you look at the Widow, it has two stakes, sticking into its spine. According to the journal entry, this is to impede its silk. This Weaver has quite literally been staked to service. It's not metaphorical, it's real. This Weaver is also very, very fanatical, to a degree that suggests insanity. This Weaver has lost their mind, and is it any wonder when their silk has been bound and their mask has been forcefully ripped off? Inside of the first Hollow Knight, the Weaver's Den talks about how the Weavers returned to their old home. Their old home is Farloom. Now, the reasoning for why they returned home is very much unknown, but my running theory is they wanted to try the best they could to finally rid the world of the grandmother. Of course, this is a futile effort, but it would be a last-ditch attempt to stop the grandmother, and also to stop fleeing. All they'd done since they escaped Farloom was hide. By doing this, like Eva, they took their life into their own hands. But if the Widow is anything to go by, they didn't get very far. No, they were tracked down and they were slaughtered. And if they were not slaughtered, they were enslaved, ripped of their dignity and their silk taken. Their deaths and their torture was not in vain though. These are the last words of the Weavers. Spiders, spiders, the burden is past. These simple bugs shall bear it full. Never to cease, never to silence. We shall die and wait and pray that one of silken strength would come and set us free. That is exactly what we are. They prepared. Multiple Weavers bound themselves in these statues. We combined ourselves to them to gain their abilities. They left things like the Farsight, a relic that in tandem with a lot of soul can snare a god, can trap it and seal it down in the abyss. They might have suffered terribly, but it was not in vain. For a long time we thought the birth of new Weavers was incredibly hard, but considering how many cages there are, and how it talks about diluted blood, for example, Weaver in 8 parts, Weaver in quarter parts, it shows that Weaver children are something that is pretty common. Perhaps the difficulty of creating Weaver children is when it comes to interbreeding, trying to create a pure blood Weaver. The Widow is most likely one of the Weavers that came from Hollow Nest, for this Weaver knows about the union between Worm and Weaver, between Hera and the Pale King. The Widow seems to have been radicalised towards the grandmother, manipulated, their mind broken and now free to be controlled and manipulated by the grandmother. This would also explain how the grandmother knew who Hornet was. For after defeating the Bell Beast and claiming it as a fast travel method, we get a cutscene. We enter what is actually the cocoon of the grandmother. Although at the time we have no idea this is what it is, if you actually look at the little platforms, they're the same ones you need to hit multiple times to get up to the platform where the grandmother is. And also, if you look around, you are in a circular cocoon of silk, the same one the grandmother is in. This is further proven by the dialogue. It says, "Ah, silk," and it says, "Come child, witness our waking." This is obviously the grandmother, but why? Although we came in a cage, she wants us to come. She wants us to witness the waking. We are a child of Worm, basically God, and a weaver, another child of God. If Grandmother Silk really wanted to stop us, why beckon us to the heights of the citadel? Why would she tell us to come and witness her waking? I've always thought it was a bit strange since I fought Grandmother Silk. She's surprisingly weak. On the power scale, she's up there with the Radiants, and yet instead of being incredibly hard, she's a little bit of a pushover. Obviously there's matters to take into consideration, like for example, the Citadel has been using her silk for eons. She's also using her silk to manipulate the whole kingdom. But even considering that, she still seems a little too weak. Considering she beckoned Hornet to her lair, I think it's very likely she was playing down her power. For when we bind ourselves in one of the endings, Hornet gets so much power, so much silk. She turns into a godly being. If all this power was inside of the grandmother, why didn't she use it? I believe the true reason is she wanted Hornet to replace her. Why else would she beckon Hornet to her lair? This is not just a fight between Hornet and another enemy. This is a fight between Hornet and her grandmother. Hornet is the child of a weaver. Considering her status, it's most likely she was one of the first weavers. And that means her child would be the granddaughter of Grandmother Silk, hence the name. Although it's never directly said, it's my opinion that the grandmother was playing down her power and wanted Hornet to bind her to herself to become the new god. The only question that now remains is what happened to the rest of the weavers? Where are they? So many fled from the deep nest, so where are they now? And the answer to that question is really unknown. The first Hollow Knight had 3 DLCs. I think it's very likely we will get some kind of information in the DLCs of Hollow Knight Silksong. Because make no mistake, I'm like 99% sure there is going to be DLCs. Sadly everyone, that is the end of the video. If you did enjoy, please consider leaving a like and subscribe as it greatly helps the channel and lets me know you're enjoying this style of content. I know this was very different to what I normally do, but I really wanted to make a Silksong lore video. Without any further ado, daddling, please friends, don't you dare go hollow, and may you find your worth in the waking world. See you in the next one, and goodbye.